Good day, everyone. Welcome to your painting snow and light through trees acrylic painting workshop. I am super excited about this little painting. It is the second in my series, so I've given you a different little drawing to work from than the first one, just because I don't like painting the same painting twice, but I do like painting series. So we're just going to do a slightly different design, and I hope you love it. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about when painting snow and actually anything white, you really want to try to work with your temperature contrast to turn your forms and make it interesting. White paint by itself, it doesn't actually have a lot of impact and it's not very interesting. It's really important for creating our value structure. However, in terms of color, it's really flat and not very dynamic. So I really like to use my color temperature contrast in order to paint very effective white things. So either it's snow or a white pet with white fur or white flowers or anything that is white. It's really challenging to paint it because white as a color itself isn't very dynamic and very interesting and doesn't carry actually a lot of impact on its own. Especially when you're starting from a white canvas, it actually has sort of an eraser effect more than anything else. It doesn't really look luminous, it looks more like an eraser. So, well, I did the first piece with direct painting, and I just went straight to color on my canvas and just painted the direct color that I wanted. I thought we would do this in a slightly different method where we paint first a grisaille and then go over with our color. We'll do a bit of direct painting and a bit of glazing to get the colors in there. Just because nailing your value on paintings like this is really, really important. So there's sort of three things that make good paintings that you have to consider at the very base, like after you make, or before you make any other decisions about your painting, whether that be how you draw, how you stylize your edges, your color palette, anything else. There's sort of three foundational things that you kind of need to understand and nail before you can create a dynamic painting. The first one is obviously the message. What is the painting about? I always ask myself this when I start, and usually when I'm going to go into a series, I already have an idea of an overarching theory or message for the series. And it doesn't have to be like a big social message or whatever. In my case, I like weather, I like being outside. For me, art is sort of meditative, and it's it's something very private that I do for myself. And so I like to kind of create spaces where people can feel comfortable just relaxing. So the message doesn't have to be complicated, but in this series, I really love, so when I was growing up in Elora, I'll just give you a little backstory. When I was growing up in Elora, we had windows, and I'm not sure what direction they were facing west. They must have been because the sun was setting there. So they were facing west, and we had a big sort of yard in the front that had some pine trees, and then there was a road and then a layer of trees and then a field, and it was always covered in snow in the winter, and the sun would set and create these really long shadows and these really warm colors. And so I just really, really was inspired by those colors and the shift of tone and the colors of the shadows and everything on the snow as the sun was setting. So I just really want to evoke those feelings that I had when I was young and growing up and looking across that field at the sun setting. So that's the overarching message. As I said, it's not complicated. I just want to capture that feeling, that lighting. So yeah, the second part after the message is obviously the composition, because basically we're doing a tree. It's not a hard composition. It's almost like painting a person. So when you paint a person, they're the focal point usually, especially for a portrait. So when you've got one person, no matter where you put it or how you arrange it on your canvas, it's obvious where you're supposed to look. There's one thing. Landscapes can become complicated when they're large scenes. So composition becomes a little bit more tricky when you have many elements that you're balancing, when you're trying to lead the viewer to one focal point. But I've set this up so we can't really fail. And we have one tree that is our main tree, and we're having the light come from behind that tree. So you can play with that idea in other paintings, but definitely the safe way, if you're wanting to get into landscapes and you're finding the composition difficult, think of one thing that can be your focal point. So like a tree, a leaf, a branch, an animal, a bird, whatever, a rock, a flower, it could be anything. Have that the main thing, and then it's almost like painting like portrait of a person. So we're painting right now a portrait of the tree, and the context is the light. It's winter and the light is setting from behind it. So that's sort of how I kind of dealt with those two things. And then the third thing that's really important to help all of this read is the value structure. So it is very difficult, especially when you're just starting out, it's very difficult to balance color and value at the same time, because color in itself carries inherent value. And then if we start trying to mess with that by adding white or black, we're actually also changing the saturation. So it becomes quite tricky to balance the two. But a really easy workaround is to just paint the painting in black and white first, and then you have all of your value dealt with. You don't have to worry about it again too much while you're mixing, and then we can lay the color on top. But I do mix, and I will show you how to mix colors so they become close to that correct value that we've already laid down. So we're using the value as a benchmark, but we can kind of build a painting so it sits on top of that, and it kind of just saves a lot of trouble. It sometimes feels like an extra step, but it is very helpful, and it will help you, especially in the beginning phases, to just create strong, visually strong works of art, because you'll have a strong message, you'll have a strong composition, and then you'll have a strong value structure, and then the color just sits right on top of that, and it just makes it so much easier. So that's sort of my little spiel on how I've set this up. I'm gonna just show you, so just a minute. So I'm just gonna show you some references that I managed to find, and recently I've been sort of like going on Midjourney to just sort of scout what people are creating with AI art, because I've found that, so I've been going on Midjourney to just sort of scout what people are generating, because I'm finding actually a wealth of really cool sort of references on there. And so I was looking for a lot of references for colorful snow, and I just wasn't really finding what I wanted for these pieces to like give me an idea of the atmosphere that I wanted. So I just went to Midjourney and I just searched, I think it was like colorful or oil painting of snow, John Singer Sargent or something like this. And then it just gave me like a bunch of references for the atmosphere that I could use on these pieces, which is really handy, because sometimes if you do that same exercise on Google, and there is a wealth of information on Google, but it's not always really in the direction that I want. And yeah, I just find sometimes it saves time in my research. So I'll usually go to when I'm looking for references for artwork that I'm going to create. If I need information on things like lighting or shapes or whatever, I will usually go to art history first of all and look at artists either alive today working or from the past who I know work in the direction that I'm trying to go. So that will be a reference point. And I know John Singer Sargent was someone who painted white often with a lot of color in his white. So that was one person that I really wanted to look at. And then also I'll go to like just normal image banks like Dreamtime or Unsplash or whatever, and just look for photos of like snow and sunset on snow or whatever. So yeah, I managed to just find a few like little references that were kind of painterly looking already, which is kind of cool because it kind of broke it down. And then yeah, so I'll just switch over so you can see those actual images. So this is what I found just doing like little Midjourney searches for different stuff. So yeah, this is kind of like the idea of that I've been wanting to sort of explain to you in advance, which is kind of cool. So if we're looking at, and usually the thing with photographs, so this is what artists do. Artists see things and then they exaggerate them. And this is kind of what the AI is doing for me already. It's extrapolating from what artists were already seeing, and it's sort of like generating these. But so what we're seeing here are like all the warms in the light. So this, I wouldn't paint this white exactly. I almost never use white by itself. This will have some yellows and warm tones in it so that we then contrast by the blues and the purples in these shadows. And then, yeah, then contrasting again with like hotter pops of color here and then the trunks. It's always a really good idea in terms of painting. So this is where this is actually what would happen in real life. So if you were to take a photo of this on your camera or on your phone or whatever, and then take it into Photoshop and then just boost the saturation, you would arrive at something like this. So you should try that definitely in some sort of photo editing software at some point. Just take some photos of things that you want to paint and just max the saturation, and you'll start seeing these colors. And you don't have to paint them exactly that saturated, but it definitely gives you a benchmark to go to then saturate your works a little bit more and make them a little bit more interesting in terms of color. Here's another example. So here it's like the same warmth in the snow, but we've just gone for a more purple tone, and it makes it look like the sun's lower in the sky, whereas this one, it looks a bit higher in the sky. And again, here, just a different image, but we've got all of these nice sort of magentas, blues, sort of cyans, and purples in through these shadows, just dancing around. And then even though the snow is quite just bright, it gives a really nice play of color on the snow, and it makes it very interesting to look at. Whereas if you were to do this just with white and adding black for shadows, or even just adding straight blue, you would actually get something that's quite boring. Adding blue to your white for these shadows would already be better than adding black, but you're still going to be missing all of the subtle details with the magentas and the purples in there. And here's another one. Again, it's pushed a little bit more to the purples and the magentas than the blues. We even have some yellows and almost oranges coming in through. And then here was another one just down here. So yeah, we've got some more oranges into where some of these, it's actually bounce light which is happening here. So basically the light is coming through, hitting off the snow, it's warmed up, and then when it bounces up into these shadows, it's turning almost an orange color, and then when it's turning into the shadows, it goes through a magenta and then into purple and blues. So this is also quite beautiful. And by the way, if you guys want to paint any of these, I will link them to you if you want to take a stab at them. Go right ahead. As I said, someone made them on Midjourney, and as it stands, these images are not copyrightable, and they were based on John Singer Sargent works, and his work is in the public realm. So these are not like images that belong to anybody. They are free to find and use. So yeah, you can, I will just attach them, and if you just feel like doing little studies to just master some color, I might even work on some of these myself. They're quite beautiful. But I usually just kind of use these to give me like color key ideas or whatever. And then, yeah, you can apply that to your own sketches even. And it just gives you like a wealth of information, especially for color direction and things. Yeah, I love this bottom one. Like this is sort of how I push my own artwork, where I'm trying to bring in these strong contrasts with the magentas and the yellows and the oranges and the blues and purples, and just kind of like really saturate things. I like how loose this one ended up turning out. These ones are a little bit more realistic. I'm currently trying to move away a bit from the realism, so these are probably less in my wheelhouse for trying to paint from, and this one is probably closer. Sorry, this one is probably closer for what I'm wanting to achieve in my own works, just because I want that more painterly quality. But yeah, some pretty interesting ideas in there. So I hope that helps you. And I apply this to fur also. If I have a white pet to paint, I will just throw that image into Photoshop, max the saturation, see what comes out, and then I use that to inform my color, not my value necessarily, because it sometimes does tweak value, but I will sort of add some of that information into the color detail when I'm painting. And then you can keep it sort of closer to realism. Like if I look at this bottom one here, even this one, these are quite, this one is quite like exaggerated, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Whereas these are more realistic treatments still. Like we could almost look at this and see a realistic painting, even though it has actually been completely overblown in terms of color. For example, if we check these photographs as snow through trees, so this is like the other type of research that I always do, but you see I'm not really getting, when I do this, I'm not really getting the exaggeration that I'm looking for. I wanted to show you guys something that was a little bit more exaggerated. But in here, let me see if I can find a good example. So like if you were to paint from these, it would be okay, but you're not really getting the depth of interest that you can get by really exaggerating. Here we have a better example where we can see all those blues and those yellows. So this is a lot closer to what I'm looking for, or even this. It's a lot closer to what I'm looking for. This one might even be AI, actually. I can't tell anymore. You can't tell anymore. So I've just started actually searching on some of those sites just to find things, because even when you're searching on Google, you might be coming across it and not even realize. But yeah, so now here we can really see, I believe that this might be, I'm not even sure. You can't tell anymore. This is going to get really scary, I'm telling you. Deep fake is like scary. But here we've got these nice blues. We could even push these cooler to the green to contrast some of these yellows. And then we've got these crazy magentas, and then it moves into some oranges, and there's like some hot magenta along the sides where there's sort of like that transition color. And then we've got these oranges here where it's backlit and it's hitting, and right along the tree. So there's really interesting color in here. So this is what I want us to aim for. And this is sort of like what I was seeing when I was young, looking out that window. So yeah, definitely before I started painting, I always just go through this sort of research of like, what direction could I go color-wise? This one's also pretty interesting. We've even got some greens up in here. We can go a bit more cyan in the color. I would still warm up some of these, and I would push a little bit more color or a little bit more saturation of this color even into those shadows, just to make them a little bit more poppy. And then we've got these really warm yellow light, and then up into here in greens, and then you could actually push some of those oranges to be a little bit more saturated up in here, so you could stay like warm sort of orange green and then go into an orange color. And then here there's even some hot reds and things, so you can really play more hot reds up there. And then here we've got some like really cool blue, almost purple green, so you can really play with those colors there. And these ones have probably actually already been had the saturation blown up or maxed up in Photoshop before they publish the photograph. Sometimes when you find photos online, the artist will, or the photographer will have already done that. So here's another cool one. But yeah, this one's really blasted out though. See, I can tell that they did that on this one because it's clamped. And this is usually what happens when you do throw things into Photoshop like this. You'll get these areas of clamped color where the detail just disappears and the color becomes almost a solid. But then you can see, if you're not looking at that as your detail image, you're just looking at it as the color image, you can see really clearly what's going on in these transitions through like cyan to magenta to blue purples, and then these like hot oranges. So definitely do some just Google search in this way before you start works, especially if you're just kind of trying to make them up. And you'll get like a wealth of knowledge that you can just kind of store on a folder somewhere and just refer back to as you're painting. All right, so let's talk materials. So clearly we're going to need to start, because we're doing with the Gresaille. If we're doing a Gresaille, we're going to need to start with a black and white. I like the Tri-Art paint and the Liquitex paint, and I also use golden, so you can use any of those. I have an ivory black here and a titanium white, so we'll be using that for the background. We're going to need a yellow, so I usually use a cadmium free yellow light. I find it is the most opaque yellow, so it carries its weight with other colors, and I only use the one. This one is neither too green nor too orange, so I don't run into any problems in my mixes. I always use a Payne's Gray. This one is, oh, I just realized that my camera is reversed. Just give me a minute. I just want you guys to be able to read this. And also your image is going to be backwards, so that's why I was confused. There we go. Okay, so this one is the Payne's Gray from Winsor Newton. Here's your little tree, looks way better. I use this a lot for glazing. It's kind of a perfect glazing color. I also use a quinacridone magenta as my cool red, and I use a pyrrole orange as my warm red. It's very orange. As my purple blue, I use an ultramarine. And as my green blue, I use a cerulean blue. I have hue in this case. Sometimes I get the regular one, but it's way expensive. And that is essentially all we need for this painting. I like to use flat paintbrushes. So I also always have a Stay Wet palette with me. I have the Mastersons here. And I just actually I've run out of small paper, so I just cut it from a bigger palette, but I also put a paper towel in the bottom because I find the sponges that they come with get a bit moldy after a while, and that gives me the heebie-jeebies for health reasons because I don't know what kind of mold it is. So I've just been using the paper towel. It gets less moldy in general, and then I just toss it at the end of my painting when I'm done with that palette. In terms of brushes, I usually I like to use a variety of flats and rounds, and I tend to try to scale them for my painting. I'm sort of getting low on brushes. I need to buy some more. I just don't want to spend the money right now, so I'm still using these ones. You may see me struggling and cursing a little bit at the quality of my brushes. Got a few more here. I kind of like the Noble brushes. For acrylic, I find they work really well, but I usually just have a mixed bag. Oh, the Simply Simons ones are also amazing. I'm going to try to locate those online for everybody. Obviously, also paper towel, and I have my handy first painting that I did of this. My camera isn't really picking up the warms. Unfortunately, there's a lot of pinks and oranges in here that just are not being picked up. But it's funny, it just doesn't do it. But yeah, so I'm just going to be referencing my initial painting. So usually what I'll do is I'll sort of sketch out a concept in Procreate first and then paint from that. And then when I'm doing versions, I usually just use those to kind of reference. And then I've already got a new tree design sketched out. As you can see, it's not identical, but it still fits within the series. And when I paint it, it's still going to fit within my series. So as mentioned, we are going to first do our grisaille. So the only colors that I need right now are my ivory black and my white. So ivory black, we probably don't actually need that much. It's a very big thing. I'm working on an 8x8 canvas. You could do this at any size you wanted. I will probably do a huge one of these. I like to do different sizes for different people's desires, I guess, for their home decor. Sometimes people like to buy original works, but they don't have a big budget, so they like small pieces that they can kind of tuck in little smaller spaces of their homes, and other people just want to buy a nice big piece for their living room or above their bed or something behind their couch. So I've got my black and white, and I'm literally just going to start going in. I could start maybe with my, let's say, there's a tree line back in here. I want to give something on that horizon, and it's a fairly light gray. So I'm just going to start with this. And just kind of place where this goes back there. I feel like I already need to curse this paintbrush. I like very sharp edges on my brushes, and they kind of drive me nuts when they lose that nice sharp point. But I'll use what I've got. And then there's a branch in here, so I'm just going to kind of avoid that. And then I think I'll take one of my smaller detailer brushes here. Although this might be overkill right now. I actually don't need to go into too much detail on this, but I do want to kind of break up some of those treetops here. They're a bit harsh. You just want to see the shapes of trees, and you want to make sure also that you're varying the size of them and like the height and the shape a little bit. So I will end up putting some more lights in here, but that will be sort of, it gives me sort of an idea of kind of where I want my mid-light tone value to go. Obviously the tree, because it's backlit, it's going to be quite a bit darker, so that will create a nice value contrast and composition within the painting. And then from there, much of what's in the background, because the light is coming through those trees, is almost white. I don't go fully white until the very, very end, because if ever I need a bright white or a bright highlight or light, I need something to contrast with. So I usually keep my quote-unquote white value in the overall painting sort of around a 2 or maybe 3 on the light scale, toward white, I mean. So if white is a 0, I would put my lightest light as about a 2. And that way I still have a couple of values to go toward white to create some impact. I do think it's time for me to buy new brushes. I keep wanting to reach for my rigger brush, and that's just kind of a very inefficient brush for what I'm doing, but it tells me that it's it's time for new brushes. So I'm just gonna kind of leave space for some of these branches. I don't want to like cover them completely because I do still want to see where I want to paint them. I mean, obviously, like I don't need to keep them here exactly. It's not written in stone by any means, but so we're just kind of trying to put this wherever I see there might be sky poking out between all these little spaces. Branch up in here, I guess. Put some branches in through here. I think I'll just put some background in anyways, and then I'm just gonna, I know that I want more kind of branches up here where they start getting a bit thicker, but I can also put some gradient down just so it sits behind those spots. Whoops, I don't want to go darker. And I do like to keep the wet piles sort of intact because I find it easier to match values mixing into wet than mixing into dry, because acrylic darkens when it dries. That's partly why the Stay Wet palette is so handy. There's going to be another little tree in here. Some of the sky in here. It kind of looks, it always looks a little bit abstract still when it's just black and white. And see, this darkened quite a bit, so I need to go in and make some of this a bit lighter. Okay, so from here, if we really want to, we could tackle some of our darks in the tree, and I'm not going to go black. I don't like to go to darkest dark. I like to go to a dark gray. Things darken also as you glaze, so I like to keep that in mind also. So when I'm creating my grisaille, I do like to try to keep it a little bit away from the actual black spectrum or value, just because it's so much easier to just go darker than lighter. I'm just adding some water to my brush right now. It's not really runny, it's just enough to make the paint move. That's okay. You can add water to your acrylic. Just don't go too overboard with it. But I have been adding water to my acrylic for about, God, like 20 years now. And I've never had a painting fall apart. Not even ones that I still have from when I was that age. So something I do want to think about. I don't know if you hear my dog growling. There's a dog barking, and now my dog's growling. Rosie, that's enough. Good girl. So we do want to watch on this side. We need to be going a bit lighter. Just gonna add a little bit more white in here so it's still in the darker range. But it's a bit brighter because the light starts coming around. And we can keep going over these, but I do want it to be darker than that background because it's still backlit. Got some sort of bark coming up in there. I think this is going to be like a big pile of accumulated snow here. I've always loved trees with big roots. There's something just so magical about them. I'm just kind of following that line work that I created on my canvas. Just to sort of nail some shapes and shadows and bring out some nice little roots. Happy little roots, as Bob Ross would say. It's in happy little roots. Oh, Rosie. Oh, Rosie, that's enough for me. Ended up rearranging my studio space because my husband and I were competing for sound space, which I never knew was a thing until it was a problem. But basically, we have a very tiny little home where I was trying to paint and film classes, and he was trying to just exist. And it was impossible. And then on days when he was working, and he has a lot of meetings with like the city, so I would have to stay very quiet. He was on meetings basically all day, so I couldn't get any work done that required any kind of quiet or sort of sound recording. So we ended up changing around the apartment the best we could to accommodate that. The only problem is now there's a dog who barks upstairs, and then my little pup always likes to sleep where I am. So now she's just kind of growling away over here. It's kind of cute. I really like Gresaille too because it feels so much like drawing, and it doesn't take too much focus to just kind of develop and establish black and white painting, because we're not having to worry about color mixing or like any other thing that goes in with sort of the more complicated parts of painting. It's just kind of relaxing. So we'll create some like someone's bark in here, direction that this is growing. So now we can already start reading this contrast, which is nice. Got some little pine leaves and things in here. Where I grew up, it was all these beautiful, majestic pine and cedar. This is a bit like inspired by some of those cedars with the like low branches, and they've got all these nice round drooping branches, and all of these boughs of cedars coming off. There's a few like that in my neighborhood right now too. Really pretty trees. And they kind of like, if you don't trim them back, they get really, really thick, and they create almost like an umbrella where you can go climb in underneath them and underneath the branches, and they kind of give you a lot of shelter. And there's a few like that up at our skate park, and the homeless population have started in the winter, they put tents in there and they just use them as homes, which is kind of cool. They're like, they need a place that's safe, and people don't really bug them there. It's kind of private. You can't see the tents at all because the boughs are so low to the ground, and they create such a nice amount of privacy for them. And they really leave people alone up there. They just kind of don't bother anyone, and they've got sort of a secure space to kind of call home for the winter that's a little bit sheltered from the elements. So I want to sort of incorporate some of that feeling of those low-lying crossing branches and things. Obviously more stylized because it's fun, but I did take a look at the way some of those trees kind of grow up there to sort of inform these little sketches. And I find it easy to do like sort of like my lightest tone and one of my darker tones in the beginning on these, and then work sort of between that. It just kind of helps me sort of establish the overall contrast. And it's actually, I think, looking a little bit more contrasted even in the video than real life. And because it's acrylic, if we make a mistake, it's not really a big deal. We can just paint back over it another time. That's one of the beauties and strengths of painting, and it's harder to do in watercolor. Oil, you can also just go over things. It's a little bit more complicated in oil. It takes a little bit more work, but it is fully possible. Some snow coming in here, but because it's still kind of on the shadow side, it's going to be more of a gray color than a white color. And then this is where I really have to start thinking about my grayscale composition, because if I put the same value on top of another value, it's not going to read. So I do need to be careful. So often the snow accumulates on the top of the bark ridges and sort of on and between. So I'm going to kind of add some of that in. Add a little bit more white in there. Here I'm just trying to sort of add where the shadows happen in that snow too. So I'm staying on the lighter side of my values, even though I'm sort of playing between them. And I'm just sort of aiming for the average values at the moment. And then you'll find also painting into wet acrylic versus fully dry acrylic gives you different effects, which is kind of cool. You'll get sort of a softer blend. That is way too dark for where I like to go, I think, but I'm just going to continue adding some of these little lumps and bumps. And I just really work back and forth. I'm not really doing like one value and then the next. I'm just kind of tackling areas. Just trying to imagine sort of how the snow might build up and around these roots and things. So just because you use Grisaille, so Grisaille is great for accuracy. It's really, really great for accuracy. But it doesn't mean that you have to do realistic paintings using Grisaille. You can equally use Grisaille on paintings that are stylized. So there's so many decisions that you take when you're building a painting. And a lot of it is sort of drawing and brushstroke, and a lot of the style that you see that people are developing, it's more in terms of how they're handling like drawing or representation of things and how they handle maybe their edges, and how they handle their color. But the exact techniques that you use to get there could actually be quite classical and designed for realism. So you don't need to assume that just because we're doing a grisaille that it needs to be realistic. Like I'm still really stylizing this tree. Like we don't, these trees don't actually really look like this necessarily. It's close, and I've been looking at these trees quite a bit for reference and information, but I haven't like tried to literally draw a tree. You know what I mean? But I am using realistic or realism sort of adapted techniques in order to just get the accuracy that I would like in the lighting. And then the colors are going to be wacky. My friend calls them my acid paintings because they're very brightly colored. And then some of these areas where the light is going to be hitting some of these branches, that's where I'm going to push toward white. But again, when I draw these, or when I paint these areas right now, I'm going to make sure that I'm staying away from pure white. I'm going to go with the pure white at the very end so that it can have some impact. I've got some darker grays up in the belly of my brush there, so I'm just going to use them. And on this side, it's all sort of shadow. Some highlights coming through, but there's a lot of shadow. Sometimes I run into these little areas where I've gone too light somewhere and then I'm going to lose an edge, so I'll just go back around it with some dark and then go back and add the lighter color. And kind of create the illusion of like piled snow in there. It needs to be shadowed, but it still needs to look like snow. This is maybe like a little clump of snow here, so it's going to come up. And the shadow comes in this way, and then there's going to be like a bit of highlight on the top. There's a shadow at its base. Maybe some shadows in and around this way. A bit of a highlight along its ridge here. The other thing that you can do on these, I usually leave it till the end, but you could do it here too if you're finding that your grisaille isn't good enough, and we'll see. I might do this step when we're done. But I've got some snow areas in here that are actually quite a bit in shadow. If they're not dark enough, I can just subtly glaze up the thing with even just some transparent black, just to sort of drop the value of a section so that it just reads more interestingly. So where it's like directly cast from the tree, I might just glaze all of this area, and then the shadows on the lighter parts of the snow, like in through here and up and through here, are already going to read lighter. So it means that I don't need to be too exact at this point with my values. I can aim at sort of like a benchmark for them, but if I've missed a little bit in the overall value structure, I can go in and adjust that with glazes very easily. It just helps to bring everything together sort of coherently. I think I just want this to be like a little twig. Like line across the snow here. So we're all going with like a finer brush later and just kind of fix up the drawing of it and add some details. Just trying to suss out where all these branches and things are. And yeah, so like if I want this to kind of come up on a branch here, like on a big root piece, and I want it to be like a very white highlight. Like I want the light to hit here. I'm gonna have to put what's behind it quite dark in comparison, or it's never gonna give me that punch that I want. White really needs, or like highlights or light needs to have something to contrast with if you want impact. You're never gonna get it just by using value alone and without carefully planning your values. Got some shadows maybe. So these areas are a bit bigger. I'm just gonna grab my flat brush because this is a bit ridiculous. I'm literally just using that detailer because I'm finding that my flat brushes don't have the point that I want. It's kind of handy though too for the long lines, I guess, of these branches. I do also, even when I'm painting grisaille, I will continue the grisaille to the sides. So I like to paint my sides as I go. It's way easier than going back. It will drive you nuts if you have to go back and color match everything that you no longer have on your palette just to do the sides. And when I'm painting grisaille method, I also go over the sides with grisaille because then my layering across the top of the painting and around the edges and onto the side is consistent. It looks really, really weird if you try to go back and paint the sides using a different style or at a different time. It just kind of doesn't work super well. Definitely, I prefer painting with a flat brush. I'm gonna head up into here. I think I'm gonna come in this little sort of split in the trunk there. Switching to my other brush just because I feel like I need a bit more precision in here. Again, I'm sort of dealing with the trunk of the tree in here. Just snow coming up here, some branches coming up this way. Sort of adding in some of these little twigs and things, the branches that are coming across. See, this is where my values start to get confusing. So I will say that color can help in sort of clarifying what's going on, but you don't want to rely on color to help you for that. So I would say it's best to kind of work the value first before trying to work the color to get it to read. If you can get it to work fully in value first, you're going to have a much stronger painting. And there's snow accumulated on the top of these branches. Sort of doing a dark shadow version first, and then I will go over with my highlights. I just want to fill the canvas with paint. I don't know how people do paintings really fast. It just seems like I just don't even know how to get the paint down that quickly. I don't think I'm that careful. I'm going to start teaching paint nights though, so I'm going to have to figure it out. We give 2 hours per class. You got to finish the painting with those students in 2 hours. And they want a 16 by 20, but they're also like incredibly simplified compositions. And they're really not very complicated. But I'm really actually kind of excited to see what teaching those classes does to my painting overall. I think it will actually be good for it. I think I'll see some improvements in my painterly quality and my ability to kind of get information down quickly. Again, I gotta watch out. Even though there's snow on this and it's white, it's got to stay darker than the sky behind. So this is where things get kind of fun and challenging with painting, especially painting something like bright snow, because snow is white and reflective. So there's definitely like a little bit of a puzzle there in terms of value structure to get it right. And again, you gotta watch your contrasting values. You can't put the same value on top of each other. You're gonna lose that line. There's a little tree in here too. I don't think I want it quite as dark as what's going on here, but it needs to be darker than this. So let's see. And this is gonna darken as it dries. I will put some snow on top of these branches later also. So I'm just gonna kind of try to paint a mass in for now. Like a value mass. I just kind of clean up those lines as I go around them. They got a bit fuzzy. It wasn't in love, so I can just kind of clean them up. Just adding some shadows in and under this grass here because the light's coming this way, so it's gonna end up being shadowed. And I don't know about you, but I can only paint so long without taking a break, and I'm finding generally that's about an hour and a half of painting. So I'm going to take a break. I think we've done enough actually on the Grisaille for now, so I will scan this and upload it for you to use as reference to kind of paint from. Yeah, and then I'll see you next week. Take care, guys. Bye.